Ladies and gentlemen, this is the operator. Today's conference is scheduled to begin momentarily. Until that time, your lines will again be placed on music hold. Thank you for your patience.
Welcome to Philanthropy New York's webinar, Should We Be Afraid? Scariest Trends in Philanthropy. Hi, my name is Anna Pond, and we are delighted that you are joining us today for this call. It sounds like an ominous program. I don't think it's going to be, but it is an interesting topic that we're going to be discussing today. I just wanted to take a minute and set the stage for it. Philanthropy New York's delighted to have this program. It comes from, you'll hear a little more about the history of it, but it comes from a blog that David Callahan, our moderator today, will be posted in October of 2014, and Alliance picked it up in an article, and Alliance magazine looked at it from an international perspective. And I'll let folks talk about that, but we're delighted to have you all today. I'm going to introduce our speakers briefly. We have Tim Ogden, who is a contributing editor to Alliance magazine, who will be following me in the lineup. We also have Charles Keaton, who is a Philanthropy Practice Research Fellow at the Center for Giving and Philanthropy at Cass Business School at the City University of London. And our moderator today is David Callahan himself, the originator of the article, and he is the founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy. So to set the stage for how this topic is going to be talked about today from an international perspective, I'd love for Tim Ogden, the contributing editor from Alliance, to share some thoughts.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome everyone. Anna asked me to set the stage a bit by talking about why we did this piece in Alliance, looking at David's original piece and its implications internationally and its resonance internationally. And David's piece was provocative in the best sense of the word, raising some issues that are often talked about in the corners of conferences, but not as often discussed quite publicly. And so we very much appreciated David's bringing this out to open air discussion. And part of our role at Alliance is to connect the trends in the philanthropic sector in the United States, which is globally quite large, to what's happening internationally, and understanding where trends converge and where they separate. What the international audience can learn from what's happening in the United States, and what the international audience can teach those practicing philanthropy in the United States. And so we reached out to a variety of people around the world with David's original article and asked them to say, are these trends, A, happening where you are, and B, of concern? And the responses were quite interesting. If you were to put it in the simplest terms, you would say that the majority of respondents said that no, these are not particularly worrying trends, if they're trends at all in our context. But I think if you look at the answers a bit more deeply, there's a little bit more to be said about that. For instance, a number of the contributors said, no, it's not a scary trend that new wealth is being looked to as active problem solvers outside of the democratic process. Because that perspective came from well, yes, those people actually do know better than our elected officials or our government, and so it's not worrying at all. It's not. There wasn't a pushback against the idea of philanthropy wielding that influence. It was that even that trend carried even further than David was identifying here in the United States. There wasn't any pushback on it at all. In other places, there was the comment that we could only wish that philanthropists were trying to influence policy, which is a scary trend in its own right in some places where government control of independent action is so oppressive as to prevent much of the social engagement that occurs domestically. That philanthropists are afraid to truly engage on certain issues because of the government stance on those and the potential for government punishment of those, which again carry over to the United States as we understand, what is the role of philanthropy in a democratic society and what are the legitimate bounds. And finally, there is this question that David raises of not just philanthropy's influence, but the sense that philanthropy's influence is a problem when it's coming from people who I don't agree with, but perfectly fine when it's coming from people that I agree with. And we see some of that coming along internationally as well. In some of the comments, for instance, that where philanthropy internationally is trying to influence social policy, it's coming from a very conservative viewpoint. And that the philanthropists in those contexts aren't in the, say, so-called progressive camp. But that doesn't necessarily change the point that David's making. That's still philanthropy providing influence on policy, and it's either something to be concerned about regardless of who is doing it and what their perspectives are, or something not to be concerned about because of the balances. And so we think this has opened up a important area of discussion, both domestically and internationally. And we're thankful to David for raising these issues and for our number of contributors, including Charles, who's going to talk some about his particular perspectives on that as well. Anna, back to you.
Sure. I'm really going to turn it over very quickly to David, who is, as we said, the founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy and originated this article. David?
Thanks, Anna, and thanks to Philanthropy New York for hosting this session. Tim, thanks to Alliance Magazine for focusing this attention on that article. Full disclosure, I wrote this article in about 2 hours on Halloween Day, because we're always at Inside Philanthropy looking for fun, gimmicky pieces. And I should note that this is kind of a gloom and doom piece, but a month later I wrote a piece about 7 trends in philanthropy to be thankful for Thanksgiving. So, we write about a lot of, there's a lot of great stuff going on in philanthropy right now, and very exciting things happening. But there's also some pretty scary stuff, and this article was really about the scary stuff. So let's just jump straight into these 5 scary trends. So the first trend is the growing push to convert wealth into power through philanthropy. Now, of course, this is hardly a new thing. Philanthropists have long sought to use their wealth to shape the direction of society in ways that they see as positive. But I would argue that things have been taken to a new level in recent times. The wealth boom of the past 2 or 3 decades has created enormous concentrations of money at the top of the economic ladder, tremendous historic fortunes. And what's different between now and, say, the first Gilded Age is that many, many more people are really, really rich. And many of these people are turning to philanthropy early in life. They're not waiting until the end of their career. They're moving energetically into philanthropy. And a lot of them have some pretty big visions for how to change society and key sectors of society. And nearly anywhere you look in U.S. society today, you can see philanthropic muscle helping kind of move the debate in one direction or the other, whether it's science, environmental policy, social rights. But I think that education is probably the best example. Over the last decade, we've seen an influx of pretty high-powered, aggressive education philanthropists into a space that was long considered one of the most democratic spheres of American life. The area where the ordinary person had sort of the greatest say. Education, public schools, highly localized institutions, and we've seen in many, not just at the federal level, but in many cities, in many states, a kind of new generation of funders. Many people are familiar with this. We know about the rise of charter schools. The Walton Family Foundation has played a huge role there. Lots of local donors, often from finance, have been very instrumental in the charter school movement, and they've had some big impacts. I think the best single example within this area of the influence of private money over education has been the Common Core and the role of the Gates Foundation, spending hundreds of millions of dollars in bringing the Common Core to sort of the center of the educational life. In effect, private money helping shape how tens of millions of students will learn in school every day for years to come. That is a powerful example of converting wealth into power. Second trend, philanthropic dollars have become another form of political money. When I think of the money coming into politics, this kind of swollen river of dollars trying to influence the direction of U.S. Public policy, I tend to think of it as sort of three different tributaries. The first two tributaries are quite familiar. Money going to elections, to parties, to super PACs, to around election time, to candidates. The second tributary of this river of money is also familiar. The money that goes to lobbying lawmakers and policymakers to shape the decisions they make once in office. But I'd say that there's a third really big river of money going into politics, and that's nonprofit public policy, advocacy, and research. Now, again, this is not a new phenomenon. The conservative philanthropists in particular had huge successes starting in the 1970s and into the 80s and 90s in building a powerful infrastructure of think tanks and legal groups and leadership development institutes to shape public policy and to try to move U.S. politics to the right. One thing we've seen in the last decade is progressive funders getting a lot more savvy about playing that game as well, and at a higher level. The Democracy Alliance, which was founded in 2005, is a great example of that. A group of wealthy funders coming together to pool their funds to try to influence politics and public policy. Lots of new think tanks that have been scaled up over the last decade. But here again, one prime example I think is really telling, which is the LGBT rights movement and the push for marriage equality, where a handful of very motivated, highly strategic donors have really had a huge impact in moving that agenda and moving marriage equality forward. Tim Gill, David Bonnet, a number of lesser-known funders who have been have deployed their money to scale up an infrastructure of advocacy groups and legal groups pushing for marriage equality, bankrolling grassroots efforts at the local level, and meanwhile, they've also, many of them have simultaneously made political contributions, and they've kind of pursued a two-track strategy of pushing money through the nonprofit groups and also pushing money through campaign elections. Tim Gill, for example, not only has the Gill Foundation, which has probably been the most influential LGBT funder, but he also has the Gill Action Fund, which has very strategically deployed money to help elect marriage equality-friendly legislators. Third trend, decline of the public sector relative to private funders. This is a trend I think that people are maybe less familiar with and is only now becoming kind of more apparent, which is that, you know, if you look at the long-term trends and what's happening right now, federal discretionary dollars are being squeezed and will continue to be squeezed in the years to come as the expenses for entitlements come due, as expenses for public debt come due, and as well we see major fiscal pressures at the state level. In effect, government as an agent of activist change, as the ability as an actor who can do big things, take risks, experiment with new kinds of policies and programs, is just becoming less powerful, and that will only become more so. Whereas private philanthropy is surging, there's more money coming onto the scene, more donors operating in more areas. We see science is one example where you can see this government cutbacks in scientific research. Meanwhile, new donors like the new foundations like the Simons Foundation coming to the fore to help fill the gap. Education, another example where often strapped city governments go directly to philanthropists and say, we need help. We need you to help plug these gaps. And we've seen that in Boston. We've seen that in Philadelphia. We've seen that in New York. We've seen that in a number of cities where philanthropists are stepping forward to deal with fiscally strained situations. But of course, that money always comes with strings. I think a great example that really has stood out for me is public parks. Again, a sphere, kind of core sphere of democratic life at the urban level. Once upon a time, we decided, at least in theory, democratically, where to locate parks, how much money to put into public parks. And now we're seeing those decisions increasingly being made by private funders. And a great example of this that I wrote about in an op-ed in November is Barry Diller's gift of $130 million to build an island park on the west side of Manhattan, leveraging another $40 million or so in public spending. Well, do we really need another park on the west side of Manhattan where we already have the Hudson River Park, and which is one of the most affluent neighborhoods in New York City, at a time when dozens and dozens of parks around New York are in disrepair in poorer neighborhoods? And is this new park really going to be the kind of park that ordinary New Yorkers need, with playgrounds and fields and places for families? Well, arguably the question for those answers is no. The answer to those questions is no. And this is kind of an example of a vision of public life being charted by a single billionaire donor. In many cities across the country, we're seeing even larger private investments in public parks. In Houston and Tulsa, on the one hand, there's a lot to like about this. Public parks are good things if you if government can't afford to do them, to build them. It's nice that philanthropists are stepping forward, but often there are downsides, and it does raise troubling questions about who's getting to make decisions. Again, to me, the through line here is not whether you agree with some of these policies or disagree, but really it's about who decides. And I think there's a lot of concern that this rising activist philanthropy may be ushering in a new age of civic inequality. Fourth trend, the rise of the know-it-all funder. Granted, this is a more amorphous trend. It's harder to kind of document, but I think that many of us can perhaps fill in the blanks here with some of our own examples. One characteristic of today's funders is that many of them are, as I mentioned earlier, they're coming into philanthropy earlier in life than previous generations of funders, often while they're still in the prime of their careers. Many of them have made money by doing really innovative things, and they have a high sense of confidence in their problem-solving skills and their ability to be innovative, and that can be a recipe for some problems. You could look at Mark Zuckerberg's gift to the Newark school system of $100 million as perhaps an example of that. Zuckerberg and other funders like Bill Ackman sort of jumped in there thinking, wow, this is a great chance to be disruptive and innovative and really turn things around, but without perhaps doing the due diligence to figure out basic questions like, well, can you get the community to buy in? Because as we saw, when that doesn't happen, things can go badly awry. I might mention Pierre Omidyar's First Look Media as another example of a funder kind of getting in over their head. Fifth and final trend, which is the rising flood of anonymous money that is coming into philanthropy. The traditional foundation model is a pretty transparent one. You put money into your foundation, the foundation gives it out, it files a 990, all the grants are revealed. These days, however, more money is going through donor-advised funds, which have become a very popular giving device, and of course do not have to reveal where the money goes. So donor-advised funds have a number of advantages. One is certainly that it makes it easier to give money anonymously. Mark Zuckerberg is an example of, perhaps a leading example of somebody who's chosen a donor-advised fund as the principal vehicle for his philanthropy through the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. A number of other donors have done this. And what we've seen, too, is the rise of these kind of new kind of collections of donor-advised funds, such as the Donors Trust, which is the leading kind of conservative group of donor-advised funds, and has been called the ATM of the conservative movement. We see money going to efforts to ban abortion or deny climate change or what have you that are coming out of Donors Trust, controversial issues that people might not want to have their names attached to, but it's impossible to see where that money comes from. Again, not new. We've had the Tides Foundation on the left to serve a similar example of this, but seems to be scaling up and quite significantly. And without transparency, accountability becomes all the more difficult. And ultimately, one easy antidote to some of these scary trends is having more transparency, just to know what's going on here. The question of accountability and how to check some of these trends is more complicated and more daunting. So I'll just leave it right there.
So Charles, I think we should turn to you to get.
Thank you.
You're brought in to bring some international perspective to this and to be a voice of considering how these trends manifest abroad. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to Alliance Magazine and to Inside Philanthropy for really putting these issues on the agenda, and for Philanthropy New York for raising them and bringing me in. What I can say is that I can provide a perspective and a vantage point from my position in the UK. The trends that David identified, I recognise them in the UK context and the European context, and therefore, notwithstanding what Tim was saying, I think I was surprised by the level of complacency to an extent about some of these trends that were expressed by some of the co-contributors to the Alliance piece. And I think part of that may be because the trends that are being identified in the US are still more nascent in the UK and to an extent in continental Europe, where the emergence and re-emergence of philanthropy is at an earlier stage. So I think actually this debate is very timely because it actually will some signals of what may be to come, at least in the UK context. And I think the UK is interesting because it has a mix of, if you like, the continental European welfare models, but it also has a strong American influence, or actually you could argue that Americans have been influenced by British traditions of philanthropy. But either way, UK is an interesting place for things. So I thought just in the next few minutes I would try to provide one or two comments on the vantage point that I see on the that David's identified. So on the first one, on the growing push to convert wealth into power through philanthropy, I think there's some other element underlying it, and this is not a point just about the UK, but generally, I think this is very much tied to the phenomenon of strategic philanthropy and the shifting agency and control between mainly moving from fundraising NGOs to donors. So when one thinks about that shift, if philanthropies are becoming more concerned about impact and effective philanthropy, whether it's strategic, emergent, catalytic, or any of the other words that are used, what we're seeing maybe is foundations acting themselves more like social entrepreneurs, more operating programs, adopting more venture philanthropy models. And I think that may be also part of the shift. And just to take an example in the UK context, an area that I'm interested in and concerned about, higher education. So in the UK, just to take an example I'm familiar with, in the field of Israel studies, donors who have a particular view about, let's say, the Israel-Palestine conflict in that particular field, in order to promote not simply scholarship about what is happening, but also to advocate for a particular approach to that. And you're seeing donors making explicit statements about that, which aren't aligned with the academic imperatives of the institutions. And I think it's creating tensions. And I'm not saying that by any way as a comment on the rights or wrongs of the conflict, but a very good example, even in a sphere like this, philanthropic resources are beginning to influence issues and trends at a university level. On the question of philanthropic dollars becoming another form of political money, I think David's very much right to point out that this can be a phenomenon both of the left as well as the right. Often those with a more left or progressive orientation have criticised those on the right for using philanthropy as a vehicle for political influence. But I think we can see that in the UK as well, on the left, to take an example of the Liberal Democrats, who have really done very badly in last week's UK elections, but the move to the Liberal Democrats in the UK to be part of the coalition government over the last 5 years was really funded by contributed to by a philanthropist called Paul Marshall, that created something called the Orange Book Liberals, which was about repositioning the Liberal Democrat Party as a party that was more comfortable with market principles, and it prepared the ground for them to go into coalition with the Conservatives. And I don't think it happened without maybe some of the philanthropic involvement. It didn't really attract that much scrutiny at the time, and we're not really as visible. So I think you can see it at the political level, and of course the other area is think tanks. think tanks and campaign funding are a ticking time bomb in British politics. They haven't really attracted that much visibility or attention, but I think that could soon change, particularly with negative perceptions of the elites and the establishments in UK politics, and questions about who is setting the political agenda, and that would certainly be a trend to watch in the UK. Turning to the question of the decline of the public sector relative to private funders, I mean, I think this is something that is very visible now in the UK, with a rebalancing of the state and civil society in the UK at a time of austerity, budget cuts, a Conservative government that has inherited quite a big debt and felt that there was over-rented, and with that pulling back has become a rebalancing where politicians and others have really begun to appeal to philanthropists to start investing in public concerns and public causes. And again, just coming back to higher education, where I think the trends are actually very striking, higher education being the site of a lot of philanthropic investment in the UK. There's an estimate that by 2022, £2 billion of private donations will be going into higher education from philanthropy. The figure now is about £700 million. There's an expectation of a doubling or trebling of the fundraising workforce in higher education. Now, these trends won't be so surprising in the US environment, where philanthropy has played a much bigger role in higher education, and where there are private universities. But in the UK and in continental Europe, I think universities are more associated with having buildings named after philosophers rather than philanthropists. But that's changing. At Oxford University, for example, a new donation has been made of £75 million for a new school of government named after Leonard Blavatnik, the Blavatnik School of Government, which will rival the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And that, I think, is something to watch. And if I could jump to the question of the anonymous money, while that donation and others have been publicised, I do think there's a question of the extent to which the grant agreements between donors and the recipient organisations are disclosed, both for the benefit of the donors and for the universities, and that level that may still have a different regulatory framework in the UK. So whilst donor advised funds are, I can see why they would be a concern to some in the US. I think also just with the basic foundation structures that we have now, there may be in time more push for greater transparency, and there may even be efforts to try to institute some kind of payout rule in the UK as well. So I think those are certainly areas to watch. And if I may just close on the question of the know-it-all funder and Hugo, I think there is emerging, partly as a result of the shift of agency from fundraising NGOs but also that can be a reaction to a negative perception that professionals in fundraising know best, when maybe they haven't always known best, and the marketplace of NGOs has not always worked in the most efficient, collaborative or effective way. So I think there may be an ongoing debate there, but I do think it does raise questions about power and accountability, and how donor-grantee relations can correctly be calibrated. And that brings me to that in order to make sure that works well, it's interesting to note in the UK at least, and I think to an extent in Europe, the growth of the philanthropic infrastructure with trade bodies, new consultancies, and indeed such as the one that I'm involved in setting up and running at the University of Oxford, beginning to emerge to both track, mirror, and monitor, if you like, what is happening in this new philanthropic landscape that is emerging here. So I think this debate is timely, and I hope that gives you a window onto at least some of the things that I'm seeing in the UK context.
Well, great, Charles. Thank you. That was really interesting. I have a couple of questions for you, but I wanted to give Tim an opportunity to get back into the conversation here with any reflections you might have, Tim, about what we've been talking about so far.
I do think it's instructive to hear, particularly for the UK context, of one that is closer to the American context, where the field of philanthropy being less well developed in other countries can lead to these senses of complacency, I think that Charles noted, not because these trends aren't real, but because the philanthropic sector is underdeveloped relative to the US and the UK. And so it's not entirely clear where things are going. And of course, philanthropy is, in an important sense, always political, in the sense that it is trying to affect some sort of change in the world. And so taking that seriously and engaging in the conversation about what it means to be engaged in politics in democratic societies while being outside the democratic process, I think is core to what we need to be thinking about strategically in philanthropy. The one thing I would note here that didn't come up in David's original list that I think would resonate more with the international audience, based on my conversations with some of the contributors to the original article, is a global trend of prioritizing anti-money laundering efforts over any other policy goals at the government level, which is starting to reflect in many ways. For instance, Mexico has a new anti-money laundering law that is affecting philanthropic flows to Mexico. The U.S. has been aggressively pursuing anti-money laundering to the extent of cutting off remittance flows to some of the poorest countries in the world. The UK government has also been putting pressure on banks, which has led to the closure of bank accounts for money senders, but also increasingly put pressure on funders who fund internationally and raising the costs of funding internationally, as well as potentially putting many programs at risk. And so there's my last point on that section would be to raise this other scary trend that isn't really about philanthropy, but does tie into David's overall point of the political nature of philanthropy and how it interacts with other policy goals, and how something from outside the context of philanthropy can affect the way philanthropy operates and who it is willing to fund. And an example of how democratic policy formation can affect philanthropy that doesn't necessarily seem obvious in the first place.
Charles, I have a question for you, which goes to trend number 3, the decline of public sector relative to private funders. In the UK, we've seen a period of austerity now for a number of years following the financial crisis, and budget cuts in lots of different areas. And I wonder whether you feel like that has helped activate philanthropists, brought more private money in, and sort of led, whether has seen this sort of power shift as a result to private funders.
Well, I think it's, in terms of the trends, in terms of levels of giving, the data that giving has returned to the pre-recession levels, I believe. But in terms of whether we're beginning to see a trend where the volume of philanthropic giving will increase remains to be seen. There's certainly a lot of rhetoric about the requirement for philanthropy and the obligation of philanthropists at a time of growing inequality, of budget cuts, and public sector services under pressure. And there's certainly a growing awareness amongst some of the wealthiest in society, not only through altruism, but for enlightened self-interest, that it might be timely for them to be demonstrating that they are part of society rather than apart from it, and that this would be good capitalism, good for business, and good for social cohesion, and also good politics, because we have a right-of-centre conservative government, which just been returned to office, this time without their liberal friends, and they have adopted a rhetoric of a big society in which the state retreats and individuals advance, and they've also attracted a lot of funding, often from the very same people that they want to be philanthropic to the wider civil society. So we're certainly seeing the arena set for that to emerge. But I don't think the conversations have reached maturation about, if you like, the political fallout or strongness. And I think there's a real challenge for progressives here, because the extent to which they are comfortable with using money for public purposes on the left or the left of centre, vis-a-vis, remains to be seen, and whether they will start to assert themselves in the way that you've seen progressive philanthropies asserting themselves more vigorously in the US on issues of marriage equality, climate change, marijuana, so on. And I think there's generally been an awkwardness about the extent to which the progressive funders really embrace philanthropy, because ultimately, I think, or essentially, they believe that the state is the primary vehicle of the distribution of justice, and therefore philanthropy maybe doesn't sit as comfortably with them. And I think that's where there's questions for philosophers about the political philosophy of philanthropy and where one fits on the philosophical spectrum around the role that you want private sphere to play alongside the state.
And those are interesting questions indeed. Michael Edwards has written provocatively on that subject. I want to just raise a question for both of you before we go and open it up to the audience for questions. So one response I had to this piece was that we shouldn't be worried about these trends because philanthropic donors are so diverse politically, socially. They have so many different views that they're bringing into the democratic process in society that it kind of all cancels each other out, you know, and that this is all this new money coming in and all this new energy is an example of the flourishing of civil society as opposed to something we should be worried about. And I wonder how you two react to that kind of counter argument.
Should I go ahead, or Tim?
Please, Charles.
Okay, just very briefly, I think, you know, that question, well, there's pluralism. There's this, well, you have, you know, forces on the right and the left, if you like, in this contest for the battle of ideas, and that's very democratic and very much part of civil society. I think that's true to an extent, but I think there is a question about the extent to which these are not only democratic, but can be anti or non-democratic if they don't as the beneficiaries. And that's why these trends towards participatory grant making are important. That's why these questions about governance and the involvement of diverse members on boards are important, because they really raise questions about democratic accountability. So the extent to which these big foundations of the left and right can demonstrate opening up, then I think it creates more legitimacy for and more credibility for the argument that actually it is part of the pluralism. Otherwise, it seems more elitist. And
your thoughts, Tim?
So I think there is an interesting question here. I'm at the Center for Effective Philanthropy conference and this morning, and one of the questions that was raised, or one of the issues that was raised, was that you commented on as well, David, is the marriage equality movement, and that it's an example of progress from foundations, but of course there were plenty of philanthropic funds in that fight on the other side who would probably argue that it is not evidence of progress, or in fact may argue that could argue for the fact that philanthropy is just really not that effective. This is really a more democratic movement, and that the role of philanthropy wasn't that important because there was funding on either side. I still have a lot of concerns about that, simply because plutocracy is plutocracy. Whether or not the people involved in the plutocracy have concordant or discordant views. It is a quite different system than a democratic one, where the voice of individuals doesn't depend on how much funding they have to promote that voice. And so I think it's actually quite irrelevant to the conversation of what's the role of philanthropy in a democratic society, whether the philanthropists have the same views or different views. It is a question of, are the voices of citizens equally valued, and do all citizens have the opportunity to participate in that process equally?
Thank you, Tim. I would. That was basically pretty much my same response to the critique about the pluralism and this being nothing to worry about. So at this point, we can go to questions from the audience.
So if the operator, if you could open it up to questions, please.
At this time, in order to ask a question, please press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. That's star 1 for a question. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster. And there are no audio questions at this time.
No. Would folks like to chat it in if you're on a computer? Take a moment if you'd like to chat in any questions. Great.
Well, one question is about trend number 3, and I'm
going to make it bigger so we can actually see it.
Bigger here, so we can all look at it here. So regarding trend number 3 about the decline of the relative decline, I'm sorry, trend number 3 was the
decline of the public sector relative to private sector.
Decline of public sector, yeah. Hard to keep these scary trends straight. The question is this always a bad trend? Oftentimes private philanthropy can do things more efficiently than the government can. In some ways, I would trust a community foundation to know how to best spend money in the community than an out-of-touch politician would. That's an excellent question, and I think does go to a deeper philosophical debate about what should the role of government be vis-a-vis civil society. Certainly, many would argue that we should have a smaller government that levies fewer taxes and engages in less public spending, and that instead we have more charitable dollars flowing to solve social problems. And I think to me, what's worrisome is, that question of who should be solving problems is a big and knotty one. To me, it's really about this power shift that's going on that I was trying to get at, and that it'd be one thing if we were seeing the rise of mass charitable giving by ordinary citizens to solve some of these problems, but that's not what we're seeing mainly. We're seeing activist billionaire donors trying to kind of put themselves and foundations, increasingly inserting themselves into the driver's seat of public life as government finds itself less and less able to steer because of reduced resources. And I find that alarming for the reasons that Tim was just talking about, which is it reduces the voice of ordinary people over public life and empowers a pretty small group of private actors in terms of making decisions. Any of the other panelists want to comment on this question about trend number 3?
Yeah, David, I would add there that sort of following on Marilyn's comment, plutocracy is plutocracy, and that plutocracy can be in the form of our elected officials as well. I think if you look at some of the research about who holds elected office in the United States, particularly these days, you will find it is not a particularly representative group. And so I think Liz is right in saying, is this always a bad thing, is the right question to be asking. I don't think it, when I look at these trends and think about them, it's not that this is clearly a bad thing. These are clearly things we need to be paying attention to and thinking about, and there isn't a binary, this is the right way or this is a bad thing. Where the role of civil society in democracies has always been to be a check on the power of government. And there's plenty of value in that, as long as that civil society is representing the civil society as opposed to a few members of it. And the role of government, ideally, is also to represent the will of the people, but often government isn't representing the will of the people. It's representing only a subset of them, even in a democratic society. So that's where I think we need to focus our attention, is the level to which these things are happening in all spheres, and not just the philanthropic sphere. And philanthropy can be a check on an undemocratic government, but it can also be a check on a democratic government. And that's where we need to be paying attention and thinking about what our role within the sector is in playing a proper role and not advancing one or the other sides of that conversation.
Charles, you want to weigh in on this one?
Just briefly, just say I agree with what's being said, but Liz's question was about whether philanthropy can do things more efficiently than government, and I suspect it can. It can be more experimental, it can be more innovative, and as I was saying earlier, if it's committed to strategic catalytic philanthropy, it may be able to make things happen in a disruptive way and in a quicker way than government can. But that might not be the point, because the point about government, however imperfect it is that in a democratic system, those people can be held to account and they can be thrown out. And we can work to perfect the institutions of government so it works more for the people. But in a philanthropic sphere, by its nature, there's more freedom. And if that freedom is a good and it's exercised responsibly to society, I think it can be a force for good. But I do think government and the private sphere play to different strengths, and maybe the real question facing us will be how we look at those strengths and how we ensure that those strengths are balanced well together.
Yeah, I would just add that one role philanthropy has often played is as a risk taker and an experimenter that tries out new approaches and develops new pilot projects that then later are scaled up by government. And so there's, a real kind of partnership there, and we still see that today. But looking ahead into the future, with government increasingly paralyzed by fiscal pressures, that kind of partnership may become less common. We have another question from Ben Swanger, which is, very timely given what we've just been talking about. He asked, if we should in fact be scared by these trends, what are some strategies to combat them? The great big question, and a tough one to answer. I'll take my cut first, and then we can hear from the others. The question of how to hold philanthropy more accountable or limit its influence is daunting, because there's not a lot of levers to pull, and there's questions about whether you should pull the levers that you can pull. How much do we really want to limit the flourishing of philanthropy and civil society in order to rebalance things if we feel they're getting out of whack? And I can't claim to have the answer to that question. To me, it seems like one solution is to slow the decline of government. as an agent for getting things done in society and being a kind of vehicle through which citizens can collectively address problems. It seems to me that if government had more resources in the future, as opposed to being constantly fiscally gridlocked, that we wouldn't see this kind of power shift play out so dramatically. That, of course, goes to the question of how government can get more resources, and which gets into questions of how to reform entitlement programs, how to raise taxes, who to raise taxes on, and I don't think we want to get into all of that. But just as a general principle, to the extent that government has the resources to do big things, I think that this power shift will become less prevalent. And related to that, or somewhat separate point, to the extent that we can get empower ordinary citizens in the democratic process, reducing the role of big money over our elections, getting more people voting, trying to level the playing field in the democratic sphere. That's another antidote, obviously, to plutocracy. Many different reforms we could talk about there. Finally, one other thing just that I would add is I think that transparency is very important, and as somebody who writes about philanthropy all the time and tries to track different funders, I can tell you it can be very hard to know what people are doing in any kind of timely way. I think there needs to be much better disclosure of philanthropic contributions and much more timely disclosure of those contributions. I don't want to look at the 990 2 years later when some foundation gets around to revealing it. I would like to see this information revealed more in a real-time way, the way that political donations are revealed, quarterly. And I think that there's a lot of gaps that need to be plugged overall in the rules governing the reporting of philanthropic gifts. Nonprofits, for example, don't have to report who's giving them money, and I think that you can say that makes sense if it's the MoMA, but maybe it's more troubling if it's a politically or ideologically driven think tank or advocacy group that's clearly out to have influence over public life. So those would be my thoughts, initial thoughts about what to do about some of these scary trends, and would love to hear what you two think. We could start with you, Charles, if you have thoughts here.
Yes, sure. Well, very interesting what you were saying. I think from a UK perspective, you can't really address the phenomenon until it's been identified, and I think it's therefore hugely helpful to be identifying and discussing those trends that I think are emerging here. Say we need more journalism and scrutiny and understanding of some of these trends in a way that is not necessarily sensationalizing wealthy people, which sometimes happens in the UK media, but some really forensic, close, constructive journalism that can point out some of these questions and try to raise the level of debate. And I think this is where universities can play a role. If we can develop better academic knowledge base and fields of scholarship and disciplinary settings, and maybe I would say this from the vantage point of an academic centre, but I believe that universities, along with consultancies and other intermediaries, can start to actually address questions and inform the public debates that I think need to be happening, particularly in societies like the UK, with this proposed this rebalancing emerging away from the state and towards the private sphere. And I think that really relates to the questions around transparency, around tax, what charitable causes are given tax deductions, which I know has been a big debate on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think that is clearly an interesting question for debate. So I think there are things that can be done to start beginning to address these challenges, and I think it's been the process at least is starting now, which is encouraging.
So we need to wrap up, but Tim, quickly from you, what's the solution here?
I would say the most important thing is that we recognize that these issues are real and are having the conversations. I don't think, as I said before, any of these are binary and we need to eliminate them necessarily, but certainly the philanthropy sector needs to own up to the idea that it is a political actor and take that seriously within the overall context of what they do. The more we engage in public debate about that, the better off we're all going to be in making any of these trends not be scary.
Yes.
Well, thank you both. I'm just going to turn it back to Anna to close us out here.
Sure. So I just want to give a big thanks to all of our speakers, Tim, Charles, and to you, David, for leading us through the conversation. It will be fascinating to watch the degree to which these trends are predictive here and internationally, and I look forward to continued thinking and discussion on that. So thank you so much. That concludes our webinar.
Thank you.